Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a special edition of the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chaosovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Miloš Majori and Andrew Loftusness about our 2026 Q2 forecast report for geopolitical hotspots around the world and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. In part one of this podcast, we will be discussing our outlook for global hotspots like the Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, while in part two, we will cover the US, Americas, and hotspots elsewhere throughout the world. A more in-depth analysis of all of these topics can be found in the forecast section of our website at newlinesinstitute.org. So Miloš, it's been a very eventful quarter in Q1, to say the least. Can you give us a broad overview first on what's in store for the coming quarter?
It has been very eventful this past quarter, and moving into Q2, into the second quarter, we're largely going to see the consequences of a lot of what has happened. So we will likely see a broad rebalancing of the global system across the security, economic, and diplomatic spheres, mostly with the US-Israel conflict with Iran serving as the nexus for all of these shifts. The war is likely to enter a new phase with important implications not only for the Middle East, but also for US-China negotiations, as well as the evolution of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In the Americas, the US is likely to ramp up its proactive role in the region, placing economic and security pressure on some states and territories while striking deals with others. And global trade flows will continue to be redrawn as the Trump administration adjusts US tariff policy in the face of new domestic and international realities, with reverberations from the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz amid broader advances in renewable energy and AI-driven technology, which will likely also affect the global energy sector. So a lot to get into as we move into this second quarter.
Got it. Thanks, Miloš. So let's start off with the Middle East, which, as you mentioned, Miloš, is basically the center of gravity, and particularly with that US-Israel conflict with Iran, in terms of driving global shifts that we've seen, from this past quarter since the start of the conflict at the end of February, and certainly moving into Q2. So Andrew, turning to you here, before we get into our forecast, can you give us just a brief recap over what some of the main developments have been in the Middle East over this past quarter?
Definitely, and there's quite a bit to go over. Of course, it's no surprise that the main trend and the dominating story of the first quarter of 2026 in the Middle East has been military escalation with the war that the U.S. and Israel jointly initiated against Iran on February 28th. Following the start of that war, meaning the initial opening strikes from the U.S. and Israel, Iranian retaliation quickly turned the conflict regional, with strikes against U.S. forces and diplomatic posts across the Middle East, not exclusively, but especially in the Gulf states, as well as against the civilian and energy infrastructure of those Gulf states in Iraq as well, and in Jordan. And all of those regional ramifications are continuing to play out, and it remains overall a highly dynamic situation, as we will discuss in a minute. Israel also expanded its ground and air campaign in Lebanon following rocket attacks from Hezbollah into northern Israeli territory. And it should be said that Hezbollah conducted these attacks following the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, from U.S. and Israeli airstrikes. And I use the word expanded specifically with Israel. Again, just an important reminder that there had been a lower threshold of conflict going on between Israel and Hezbollah over the quarter, and certainly before that. And then, of course, along with all this, the region experienced a significant amount of hybrid escalation as Iranian forces pursued and currently are pursuing the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And then it also must be said that U.S. diplomatic efforts in Gaza failed to meaningfully advance Phase 2 ceasefire initiatives.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. And before we get into the forecast scenarios for Q2 for the Middle East, I thought it might be worth just sort of assessing how our 2026 annual forecast, which published at the end of last year in December 2025, how that's been stacking up in terms of these developments that we've been seeing throughout the Middle East.
So overall, the forecast did accurately predict that we were going to see military escalation across the region, specifically with the possibility of Israeli escalation against Iran. So again, the emphasis on Israel initiating that conflict, initiating the escalation. Of course, how it actually played out was through a joint U.S.-Israeli operation, as well as the expansion of its territorial occupation in Lebanon. And again, that is one that remains a highly dynamic situation that is developing as we speak. The forecast also accurately predicted, as we just mentioned, that Phase 2 implementation of the Gaza ceasefire would not advance in a meaningful way, primarily because it has remained and will continue to remain prone to daily tactical level disruptions, fighting still going on between Israel and Hamas. And that contributes to another of other obstacles preventing its full implementation, which we can discuss in a second here. And then we also accurately predicted an increase in tension between Hezbollah and the Lebanese government. Now, there I will note that while this is another situation where the forecast has held and it is still developing, tension between the Lebanese government and Hezbollah, of course, at this point is not the main source of instability inside of Lebanon. That is, of course, directly from the war between Hezbollah and Israel.
Now let's get into the forecast scenarios themselves for Q2. And I should note to our listeners that we look at various scenarios for international hotspots like the Middle East, and that includes everything from diplomatic de-escalation to military escalation to hybrid escalation, which can be thought of as anything non-kinetic in nature. Think things like trade restrictions, cyber activities, intel operations, and so forth. So these are all, different scenarios that we're tracking, along with, of course, the status quo scenario as well. So Andrew, for the Middle East in Q2, let's start off with the scenario that you see as the most likely and kind of outline why that's the case.
Definitely. So military escalation will likely remain the dominant trend going into the second quarter of this year. The reasons why: the U.S. and Israel, we are forecasting, are likely to sustain their air campaign in Iran throughout the quarter. I'll note that the severity of the intensity of that campaign may increase or lessen, but we do forecast that there will be a sustained kinetic campaign regardless. Partially this is because as the U.S.'s ultimate strategic objectives in Iran and its demands towards the Iranian government remain unfixed, I think it's fair to say the U.S. will likely shift towards maximum concessional demands from Iran that might make a lot of negotiations and 15-point deals, to use a specific example, a non-starter for Tehran. In addition, the U.S. and Israel, without question, maintain air dominance over Iranian territory, and their operational success to date will likely embolden them in what they think they can achieve strategically in terms of concessions from the Iranians. Turning to... Sorry, a moment. Okay. Jumping back in, looking elsewhere in the region outside of Iran, at this point, for a number of reasons, Israel likely perceives that it has a historic opportunity to more or less permanently reshape the strategic balance of the Middle East in its favor, and it assesses that it can do so by severely degrading key adversaries, of course Iran, but not just the Iranians, and expanding its territorial occupations, specifically in the West Bank, in Gaza. In Gaza specifically, we might not see an expansion past the yellow line again, but I do suspect that we do forecast that the Israelis will at least hold the territory at the yellow line for the duration of the second quarter. We will likely see territorial expansion from the Israelis in Syria, and of course, we are currently witnessing that at a high degree of intensity inside of Lebanon, and that will almost certainly continue throughout the duration of the quarter. In fact, even if the U.S. and Israel cease operations over Iranian airspace, there is a very high likelihood that the Israelis will continue their large-scale ground and air operations inside of Lebanon, most likely by occupying Lebanese territory up to the Litani River, and by permanently expanding its occupation of Lebanese territory. That long-term occupation might not be all the way up to the Litani, although that is a realistic possibility at this point.
Got it. And so what are some of the other scenarios that you are looking at?
So we're also looking at a moderate chance of hybrid escalation. The main reason for this being is that as Iran's conventional abilities and their ability to conventionally retaliate against the United States, specifically U.S. personnel interests in the Middle East and essentially every major U.S. Arab partner in the Middle East, continues to degrade, the Iranians will almost certainly attempt to escalate on the hybrid front. There's a number of ways that they can seek to achieve that, but they will most likely seek opportunities to increase economic pressure and pain on the United States and its partners. And again, this really comes down to their attempt to maintain the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians right now are essentially wagering their ability to do so against the ability or the willingness of the U.S. to sustain long-term economic pain and instability. And then, of course, there is also the potential that Iran will begin to sponsor an asymmetric campaign of kinetic attacks against U.S. and Israeli citizens and diplomats across the globe. Again, assuming that the U.S. and Israel maintain a conventional kinetic campaign over Iranian airspace.
Understood. And I just wanted to tie in here, since you're mentioning the potential for hybrid escalation. Obviously, energy sector has been a big has seen a big impact from this conflict. I'll mention that we've seen global energy markets experiencing pretty significant disruptions in the first quarter due to those geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, specifically the attacks on regional energy infrastructure out of Iran, as well as the U.S. and Israel, that elevated the risk to maritime energy routes, in particular the Strait of Hormuz, as you mentioned. So we're seeing that those attacks, especially across the Gulf countries and the shipping risks in the Strait of Hormuz, have introduced significant uncertainty to global energy supply, which have pushed prices higher than initially anticipated for this quarter. And it really just highlighted how those geopolitical disruptions can rapidly reshape energy markets, even as longer-term transitions toward things like energy electrification and clean energy continue. For this quarter, we are anticipating and forecasting that this disruption of energy production and exports through the Strait of Hormuz will see the region's major energy players accelerate their efforts to protect those shipping routes. We've already seen efforts by the U.S. as well as regional and even global players to this effect, although still inconclusive at the end of Q1. And this could include the participation of key powers, of course, the United States, but also the Europeans, the Gulf states themselves, and China. We'll also see intensified efforts that will be made at the diversification of routes for energy and broader trade. This includes the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, playing larger roles as an alternative export route for global energy shipments, and even some transit zones outside of it, like the Middle Corridor between Europe and China, as well as the Arctic region. So that's something to look out for in terms of both the hybrid escalation and their broader global energy implications. But let's round out the forecast scenarios for the Middle East. Andrew, what is your outlook for the diplomatic de-escalation scenario?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So we forecast that there is going to be, and I should say up front actually that Islamabad in the last couple of weeks has emerged as a key player, if not the key player, when it comes to mediating, as of today, indirect talks between the United States and Iran. But we are certain to see sustained diplomatic efforts from key U.S. partners in the region. Of course, we just mentioned Pakistan, but also Turkey is likely to diplomatic pressure and influence from Turkey and from U.S. partners in the Gulf are likely to have a restraining effect on U.S. operations. For example, like a severe escalation such as destroying Iran's energy infrastructure and its power grid would likely lead to a large refugee exodus that we have not seen up to this point. There's a number of reasons, obviously, why the U.S.'s regional partners would seek to prevent a U.S. escalation beyond what we've already seen. But that being said, these diplomatic efforts are unlikely to convince the Trump administration to agree to an actual ceasefire until the U.S. assesses that it has. And again, I'll reiterate that the U.S.'s ultimate strategic objectives remain unfixed, but at a bare minimum, until the U.S. assesses that it has irreversibly degraded the Iranian capability to project hard power in the region, in particular its missile program, its domestic ballistic missile production, as well as to threaten the Strait of Hormuz in a more or less irreversible way. That of course is a difficult objective to achieve, especially when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. And then again, looking outside of Iran, we assess that it is unlikely that the U.S. will intervene diplomatically in a serious way against Israel's objectives in Lebanon, Gaza, and the West Bank. I think the West Bank in particular, sort of like we assessed going into this quarter, once again, the Board of Peace is unlikely to advance phase 2 implementation of the Gaza ceasefire in a meaningful way. The situation in Gaza will again remain prone to disruptions at the strategic level from daily tactical and operational level events. That's simply the nature of that conflict. There is a higher likelihood that the U.S. would seek to mediate between Israel and Syria if conflict between those two countries were to break out, or you could say escalate. And then finally, of course, it almost goes without saying that the status quo is the lowest chance. Sorry, Ali, jumping back in completely. There is the lowest chance of maintaining the status quo in the Middle East throughout the quarter, simply because all those reasons that we just went over, both the military, hybrid, and diplomatic scenarios remain highly dynamic.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. So we'll have to wrap up there for the Middle East. Although, as mentioned, this is the sort of the nexus or the center of gravity throughout the world, and it will continue to impact, not only regionally but also other global sectors and regions as well. So with that in mind, let's now move on to our second global hotspot, which is the Indo-Pacific region. And I'll turn back to you here, Milos. First, can you just give us a brief recap on what we've seen transpire in the Indo-Pacific in this past quarter in Q1?
Well, the Indo-Pacific largely trended towards keeping that status quo that was established towards the end of 2025 during the first part of the year. And this was largely because we had both the US and China, which represent the sort of main axis in the region, wanting to implement the terms of the trade agreements that they had set forth towards the end of last year. Now, Beijing, for example, had agreed to increasing purchases of US goods in exchange for a halt in chip export controls from the United States. But it did sort of become evident throughout the quarter that there were some shortfalls on both accounts. And to give you an example, NVIDIA, the US chip maker, had been greenlit for its exports of more advanced chips to China, yet we saw quite a low demand from Beijing, a low demand which was hoped from the United States, largely due to China's willingness to rely more on itself technologically. Chinese rare earth exports did increase marginally in return, though the US did maintain efforts to diversify supplies, and we did see a few agreements being made on that front. In terms of rising tensions, the main axis there continued to be the tensions rising between Japan and China. And China halted its exports of dual-use components to Japan. Japan, on its side, managed to secure a majority government in its with the ruling party holding a snap election and possibly paving the way for constitutional and defense reform. Zooming out a bit, the US did manage to secure another trade deal with India, something that was highly anticipated throughout the rest of last year. And China, on the diplomatic front, continued its outreach to Europe, notably during the Munich Security Conference, and signed new deals with the United Kingdom and Canada, amongst other countries. And this marked quite a diplomatic win for Beijing, which always tries to position itself as a stable alternative to the US, and is something that is likely going to continue throughout the year, without doubt.
Understood. So how does this compare to what we had anticipated or what we had predicted in our 2026 annual forecast in terms of some of the biggest hits and misses?
Well, as I mentioned, this deal with India was largely anticipated and expected, and we did accurately predict it happening. Although it should be said that domestic trade developments, which we'll get into in a minute, domestic trade developments in the United States have meant that uncertainty has persisted surrounding the ratification of the deal, not just in India, but in other trading partners, such as Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries, although South Korea and Japan have signaled a commitment to their respective deals with the US for now. In terms of the hybrid escalation that we foresaw, China's escalation against Japan was also accurately predicted, as well as China's rapprochement with North Korea. We've seen a lot of moves there in the past couple of months. Though one thing that we perhaps didn't quite accurately predict was the diminishment of Chinese military drills, and we thought that there may be an increase of those around Taiwan and in the South China Sea, but to a large extent we've seen at least a continuation of the levels from last year, if not a bit of a dip, for a number of reasons, including a reshuffle within the Central Military Commission in China.
Got it. So let's now go into our forecast scenarios for Q2, starting with what you anticipate to be the most likely scenario.
On the whole, it's likely that Q2 will largely see a continuation of Q1, namely not really a major change, whether towards escalation or de-escalation. And this is largely given the strong alignment between the United States and China wanting to maintain stability in the region effectively. However, the most likely scenario, if we see a deviation, is a continuation of de-escalatory moves. So one thing that we can definitely expect is a summit between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping, which at the moment is expected to take place in May, on the 14th and 15th of May. And this will likely result in increased Chinese commitments to purchase US goods, as well as a possible cooperation in resolving the Iran conflict. And we've already seen a few moves to that effect, with China, at the very least, pledging to increase its purchases of US fuel as a result of the energy disruption from the conflict. Trump as a whole is likely to want to keep a stable trade relationship with Xi in light of the latter's growing relationship with North Korea. And it is something that we know that Trump has been pushing for a summit with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. So it is likely that we'll see more pushes for that in this second quarter. In terms of some of the other scenarios we expect, there is a chance that hybrid escalation is likely going to continue to be on the docket. Despite the United States Liberation Day tariffs being struck down by the US Supreme Court, the Trump administration has publicly stated it wants to further reduce the US trade deficit with China, including through the use of tariffs. China, if that happens, is likely to retaliate with tariffs of its own or with a slowing down of exports of rare earth metals. But above all, we're likely to see a continuation of escalation with Japan and China. China is likely to expand the scope of its restrictions and sanctions, and Japan, as a result, is likely to continue to push for deeper relations, not only with the United States, but with Taiwan. And then finally, in terms of the least likely scenario, would be a major military escalation. Now, this is largely due, as I mentioned up top, to China's purges of high-ranking military commanders during the first quarter, which means that it's unlikely that there'll be any major escalation on the military side from the People's Liberation Army. And this is largely due to the fact that new leadership needs time to be fully integrated into the command structure, which would obviously be a prerequisite for significant military action, whether it be in the South China Sea or Taiwan. However, it should be noted that given the US's relocation of certain assets from the region, notably missile defense systems from South Korea to the Middle East to deal with the war with Iran, what we may see is China trying to test the US resolve in the region, and this could come either through cooperation with North Korea for its missile tests, or through increased intimidation tactics against Japan, Taiwan, or the Philippines. It's unlikely that that will cross the threshold of a full military escalation, but no doubtedly the redeployment of these US military assets are likely to elevate tensions throughout the region.
Got it. Thanks, Miloš. And just kind of tying back to what you mentioned on the hybrid escalation scenario, in particular when it comes to trade, I will note that in our forecast, we had anticipated that global trade would trend toward enhancement in Q1 2025. And here I'm referring to our annual forecast. And this was primarily due to the US Supreme Court ruling against the Trump administration's usage of the IEEPA, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, as the basis for those global reciprocal tariffs passed last year that you mentioned. And that this assessment that the Trump administration would decrease its level of restrictions due to both internal legal challenges as well as rebalancing globally has been on track so far in this year, though the lifting of restrictions was somewhat offset by the swift imposition of a global 10% tariffs on all imports under Section 122 of the Trade Act. So for this quarter, if we're kind of broadening out, looking at trade not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also globally, we are anticipating that this quarter is likely to see the Trump administration ramp up those efforts to reimpose tariffs that were offset by that IEEPA ruling. And this includes an extension and potential expansion of that 10% global tariff on Section 122 that I mentioned. And we also see the Trump administration push for a public hearing held by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative on Section 301 tariffs in May, with the aim of reimposing those levels before July. And this quarter will also see, as we're anticipating, initial reports on the results of trade investigations of various countries under that Section 301. But at the same time, we'll see the Trump administration seek to selectively reduce trade restrictions on certain countries and sectors. And this is particularly related to the energy sector, which, as we've already talked about in the Middle East section, has seen a lot of pressure on it in an effort to reduce the impact of the war in Iran on that sector and broader trade ties. So that's something definitely to look for in terms of the hybrid dimension and in the global trade front. But let's now pivot to our final global hotspot, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I'll turn back to you here, Andrew. Can you give us a brief recap of what we saw transpire in Q1 of 2026?
Yes. So with Russia-Ukraine, the war remained at the status quo really for the entire duration of the quarter. There was meaningful diplomatic activity, especially towards the end of the quarter, and we saw things such as the formulation of proposed security guarantees for Ukraine that the Ukrainians themselves were ready to present to the Trump administration just prior to the U.S.-Israeli war starting in Iran. We were also very close to the point, again, this is coming from comments from Zelensky himself, between resuming direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, as well as the possibility of a trilateral meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin. Now, the peace process, of course, did not achieve a significant breakthrough. It was also derailed, a lot of that momentum, again, very late in the quarter by the start of the war in Iran. At the same time, working group level negotiations have begun to resume within the last week or so. Now, both Russia and Ukraine, of course, have endured significant battlefield casualties. We also saw minor exchanges of territory back and forth between both the Russian and Ukrainian armies, particularly in the Donbass, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions. And Ukraine initiated a counteroffensive in the Dnipropetrovsk region that has steadily advanced really throughout the end of the quarter. And of course, Russia sustained an intense, the most intense of the war in terms of simply the number of munitions fired, winter bombardment campaign targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure over the duration of the quarter.
Got it. And how did that stack up against what we had anticipated and predicted in our 2026 annual forecast in terms of?
For the annual forecast, we had assessed there was a high likelihood of diplomatic momentum really going into the entire year. But, and this is an important caveat, that a durable or permanent peace agreement was unlikely for a number of reasons that we have been discussing over the quarter so far. But this forecast has primarily held throughout the quarter. Again, significant diplomatic effort at the working level between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. There was very notable comments from the Ukrainians and from the Russians themselves as new negotiating teams and new personnel came in, that the talks had taken on a more positive and serious tone than at any point so far since Trump's return to office. And then at the same time, the forecast accurately assessed that hybrid activity was likely to increase really regardless of any diplomatic process at the negotiation table.
Understood. So let's get now into our forecast scenarios for Q2 of 2026, starting with what you see as the most likely scenario.
So we forecast that once again, the status quo, sustaining the status quo, will be the most likely scenario throughout the quarter. Again, the ramifications of the war in Iran are global, and part of those ramifications are a continued stalling effect on U.S. diplomatic efforts to resolve the war. Again, worth noting, we've seen a resumption of working level negotiations, but again, there's been a number of comments from Zelensky and others saying that they're not receiving the necessary signals right now, specifically from the United States, to resume that high level momentum that we saw close to the end of Q1. At the same time, some level of diplomatic activity is likely to resume. But again, for a number of reasons, such as Washington's reliance on special envoys, 3 individuals in particular with close ties to the Trump administration, and the president's preference for his own personal involvement, really all kind of add to, as opposed to traditional diplomat-led efforts. And of course, I'm referring to career diplomats in the State Department, exposed the Trump administration's peace process and negotiations to disruption and fatigue during a time of multiple global crises, such as we are experiencing right now. Now, it also is worth mentioning that even if we were to see a renewal of high-level diplomatic effort from the United States. The Trump administration is highly unlikely to provide new weapon systems to Ukraine or lift any restrictions, targeting restrictions on weapon systems that Ukraine currently has from the U.S. in a way that is likely to impact Russia's long-term strategic calculus. And of course, that has been the case for some time now. Looking at the battlefield itself, it remains likely that neither Russia nor Ukraine will experience significant gains on the battlefield. Although, once again, those minor exchanges of territory that we just referenced in Donbass, Kharkiv, and Sumy on both the Russian and the Ukrainian side are likely, as well as a likelihood of minor advances by Ukraine in the southeast. And then looking at the hybrid escalation scenario, Ukraine is likely to escalate both the frequency and the geographic scope of its maritime attacks against Russia's shadow fleet. We've been seeing that that has certainly played out in the closing of quarter one, and we assess that will continue to play out and in fact to escalate in quarter two, particularly in the Baltics and in the Black Sea. At the same time, Russia is highly likely to escalate its gray zone campaign against Ukraine's European allies across the continent, and of course inside Ukraine itself, in particular against prominent Ukrainian political, military, and intelligence officials. Looking at Europe now as a whole, in the EU, Slovakia is likely to obstruct any pro-Ukraine initiatives that the EU is trying to push forward, including things like sanctions on Russia and holding up aid packages to Ukraine, the use of frozen Russian assets and that sort of things. If the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban falls out of power in the country's April elections.
Got it. And I'll just note very briefly here, since you mentioned European countries, that we are in a time of, growing tensions between the US and NATO, not only over elements like the Ukraine conflict, but also what we discussed on the Middle East, as well as other issues like Greenland. So that level of tension is certainly something that we'll be monitoring going into Q2 as well. But that's about all that we have time for this part one of the podcast. We'll pick up with the other hotspots around the world in part two tomorrow. And in the meantime, if you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the Q2 forecast report on our website at newlinesinstitute.org. You can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates and analysis around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew.